Hello, class. Today I'm going to start part one of Melissa mcbay Merritt's essay titled The Moral Source of the Kantian Sublime. I'll be recording part two later. This is a lot of essay to bite off all at once, so I wanted to divide it into two parts. So first we have this wonderful quote or epigraph of Kant's, whereby, quote, "We see other worlds in a distance, but gravity forces us to remain on earth. We can see other perfections in the spirits above us, but our nature forces us to remain human beings." So the way in which this is understood will be better understood once we get a handle on the Kantian sublime according to how it is that Melissa mcbay Merritt understands it. So in keeping with Melissa mcbay Merritt, Kant's aesthetic sublime is not found nor located in nature. It is found in our mind. It's found in cognition. In this sense, the sublime is ideal. With idealism, and specifically for Kant, the cognitive rational mind shapes sensory experience, not the other way around. Okay? So we typically think that experience shapes cognition. In Kant's context, this is accompanied by way of both rational and sensory understanding. So let me repeat that. With idealism, and specifically for Kant, the cognitive rational mind shapes sensory experience, not the other way around. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is an aesthetical judgment? Roughly for Kant, an aesthetic judgment represents the ways in which we have pleasurable and emotional, affective feelings that take cognition away from the merely sensible, i.e. empirical, to that which exceeds our cognition of the rational and the logical. Okay? So a sublime judgment takes us away from the sensible as it's experienced directly, and it leads us to the rational limits of human cognition. So mcbay Merritt then specifies a key point on the relation of the sublime to the beautiful. We have an experience of the beautiful. When we have an experience of the beautiful, we experience an emotional feeling of pleasure. Okay. So on the other hand, when we have an experience of the sublime, we experience an emotional feeling of pleasure with the added element of fear, added elements of fear and terror. So the pleasurable feelings of fear and terror cannot be of imminent threat. Typically, the sublime, in terms of the sublime, pleasurable feelings of fear and terror are experienced at a so-called safe distance. So if we need to flee, the fear of danger and the fear and danger temporarily overwhelm anything we could consider aesthetic, right? So we might think of the connection to COVID, for example. So in other words, we have fear and terror of this virus, but we do not necessarily have a sublime experience with it because it is simply putting us in danger. So in that sense, we're not necessarily having an aesthetic experience, okay? So we need to be kept at a safe distance in order for it to be something that qualifies as a sublime experience. I mean, it would be a little perverse to think that we were getting a sublime experience out of the way, a pleasurable sublime experience in the way that we were thinking of how it is that we understand COVID-19, right? That seems to be inappropriate, perhaps even immoral. So mcbay Merritt describes a critical link from the sublime to what is distinctly human for Kant, and that is rational cognition, right? So the connection to rational cognition brings Kant to posit how this leads to our moral understanding. So recall that conscientiousness is otherwise known as practical reason. Conscientiousness is a form of rational thought in terms of normative ethical value. When we are conscientious, we make moral value judgments, okay? So likewise, when we experience pleasure from a beautiful landscape, for instance, we place a value judgment on the experience as good. When we experience the same landscape as sublime, we place a value judgment on the pleasurable fear and terror as good. The values of goodness on both accounts, the ethical and the aesthetical, are similar cognitive, are of similar cognitive worth and similarity, rationally, exceeding the rational limits all the same. So remember, for Kant, our imagination is the basic means in which sensory empirical experience is brought together for cognition in our mind. So reason represents how the sensory empirical experience is brought together logically and ideally apart from the empirical experience alone, from the sensory experience alone. It's not just that. The imagination is a way in which conscientiousness is putting how it is that we experience things together in order to understand how it is that we are experiencing those things rationally and empirically. So the imagination plays quite a role in how it is that we understand thinking itself or cognition itself for Kant. Okay. So within Kant's aesthetic theory, there are two types of sublime experience. There's the mathematical sublime. So this is the aesthetic pleasure of measuring the immeasurable. So this is where we appreciate the sublime at the limits of imagination, the senses, and reason, right? So an example I'm providing is a sublime landscape cannot be fully understood and measured by the senses, nor can it be fully understood and measured by way of reason. Okay? So it's a limitation of reason. Then we reason that there must be measurements beyond our cognition, right? So in terms of things like infinity, rational ideas of infinity and eternity. So infinity and eternity are ideal limits on the scope and reach of the reasonable and the sensory. For Kant, according to mcbay, merritt. So then we have the dynamical sublime. So this is the aesthetic pleasure of recognizing great power and force. So like with the mathematical sublime, we appreciate the sublime at the limits of the imagination, the senses, and reason. Yet we find the additive of a power greater than ourselves. Okay? So the example I'm providing is a sublime landscape cannot be fully understood by the senses in terms of its power that is greater than any individual's power of cognition, nor can it be fully understood and measured by way of reason in terms of its power to create or destroy beyond the power of any individual's cognition. Okay? So our cognition is a recognition. We cognize that there is power beyond our cognition. Or another way to put it is that we rationalize that there is power beyond rational thought itself or rational cognition. Okay? Then with the dynamical type of experience, we must also account for keeping a safe distance, as mentioned earlier. So if we need to flee from danger imposed by the powers of nature, for instance, we are then moved to the recognition of danger, as with the COVID example. Yet if we aesthetically appreciate the power of nature from a safe distance, this becomes a rational affirmation of our self-preservation, which is still beyond our control. Okay? So in other words, we might feel threatened but at the same time, when it's kept at a safe distance, that still is then that is an affirmation of our self-preservation. We're not in danger, we're not in harm's way, and in that sense, that enables us to have a sublime experience, right? You can't be fleeing from danger, so you can't be fleeing from the onset of or the oncoming tornado and have a sublime experience if you're running away from it. You get the point. Then, as mcbay merritt attests, pure reason has its limit within the context of knowledge in general, and likewise in the limitlessness of the sublime. So she writes, quote, "We must then begin with Kant's famous lament about the peculiar fate of human reason. It is burdened by questions that it is neither able to ignore nor able to answer." So in other words, part of the problem, or one way to think about this, is that there's always something beyond the rational scope of how it is that we understand things. So the limitations are metaphysical as well. For instance, the existence of God, free will, immortality of the soul, and so on. Right? So I have a diagram here as well, where we have two ways in which we're understanding cognition. One is the theoretical. Why do we need to know the theoretical? Because that's going to give us a sense of the sensible. So in theoretical cognition, we seek to know the sensible world scientifically and mathematically, and this is a limit on how it is that we're understanding things like the existence of God, ideas of the existence of God, immortality of the soul, and free will / freedom. So this is the sensible aspect of the sublime. In other words, if we're having a sublime experience, the sublime experience, aesthetical experience, goes beyond the sensible. Okay, so in that sense, when we are having this issue with how it is that we're understanding the existence of God, that is something where it's going beyond the sensible. Okay, and it is no longer an issue that can be covered in terms of scientific investigation and likewise mathematical investigation, what Kant is calling the theoretical. Then on the other hand, we have the practical. And remember that when we're thinking of practical understanding, we're understanding things that are conscientious / moral. Okay? And so this is what we're calling practical cognition. So with practical cognition, we seek to know the scope of our unlimited freedom within the context, okay, also the limitation of the moral law enacted in the name of the good. So that's what we've been studying as far as deontology. In other words, we have freedom, but that freedom can't just be doing anything we want, because that freedom is regulated and understood by way of duty in the name of the good, by way of understanding the categorical imperative. So freedom is yet another feature of how it is that we're understanding conscientious life for Kant, or conscientious cognition for Kant, that we haven't discussed yet. And the sublime is bringing that to our understanding by way of freedom. Okay, so because freedom can't be defined rationally, it is then supersensible. So freedom itself transcends the sensible because we don't know the limits to our freedom. And that's a fascinating idea that we could talk about in more detail later. Okay, so admittedly, as with deontology's importance of rationally understood duty, we also possess a similar normative goal with our aesthetic life. So we have a vocation, according to mcbay merritt, to lift ourselves up to the best of our rational nature. Okay, this is not unlike the fundamental importance of conscientiousness for natural law theory as well. Okay, remember the importance of the good for St. Thomas Aquinas. And that's the end of part 1, and we will be continuing this discussion in part 2. Thank you.